Welcome everyone to this webinar on listening and reading. I'm Monica Brady-Meyerov. I'm the CEO and founder of ListenWise, which is a listening skills building company that helps students focus on listening to improve their literacy. And I have a background as a public radio reporter and love for audio, but as I've built this company, I've learned a lot about how listening plays into literacy. So I am thrilled to announce my co-presenter tonight is Timothy Shanahan. He's a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was founding director of the UIC Center for Literacy. And before that, he was director of reading for the Chicago Public Schools, author of more than 200 publications on literacy education. So his research really emphasizes the connections between reading, writing, literacy, and the disciplines. And tonight we're going to be talking about listening and reading. So welcome everyone. If you're not on mute, please put yourself on mute so we can hear Timothy Shanahan. And I'm going to go to the next slide and have you get started, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I'm honored to be part of this and looking forward to talking to everybody. I wish I could see you all face to face, but this is the 21st century and this is how we do things. I'm looking forward to connecting with all of you. Let me just mention that I've put these slides up on my website, Shanahan on Literacy, and so if you're looking for these later, you can definitely find them there. Okay, with that said, let's just jump into this, and I guess the first slide is really about the importance of listening. You know, I'm here to talk about the connection of listening with reading, which I get asked to do a lot of these kinds of things. You know, more and more you hear folks, you know, wanting to raise reading scores, and so you know, we're going to teach science, and the only reason we want to teach science is because maybe it'll raise reading scores. We're going to teach listening and writing and any number of things because they're going to raise reading scores. And I guess I would argue, even though I'm the reading guy and I'm supposed to be here promoting reading, the fact of the matter is listening is pretty important all by itself and deserves some real attention. All we're talking about is the ability to understand spoken information by ear. It's obviously essential to communication. There are studies of it that suggest that 40 to 50% of our communication with other people is devoted to listening, compared to only 11 to 16% of communication time spent on reading. Same kind of thing. If we're interested in kids' academic futures, listening comprehension is really pretty important in college learning too. That same study estimated that 52% of the learning time in college is focused on listening, you know, students in sitting in on lectures and things like that, compared to 17% on reading. My point is listening is really important. Now I'll tell you what connection it has with reading, but wanted to get that out of the way. So if we can move this forward, Monica. The two questions that I hope we can answer is, do the best listeners read the best? And does teaching listening improve reading comprehension? And we'll make sure you have answers to both of those tonight. We can move this forward. On the first one, that notion is there a relationship between listening and reading? Do the good listeners become the good readers and so on? The studies show a clear relationship between listening and reading. And you know, I didn't attempt to be comprehensive here, but there are studies on this going back decades. So this isn't something that's brand new. But for example, listening comprehension was found to explain unique variation in reading achievement in grades 1, 3, 5, and 7. Essentially what that kind of study, if folks can mute their phones, it would really help. Help everybody to listen better. Essentially what a study like that does is it tests students' reading comprehension ability, and then tries to see, you know, what connects to that, what correlates with reading comprehension, and typically controlling for some other variables like, you know, IQ or family socioeconomic status. And what it's finding is with the youngest children, with the oldest children, that in these studies, the fact is, even with those kinds of controls, listening comprehension is related to reading comprehension. Listening comprehension has been found to explain variation in reading comprehension beyond what's explained by decoding as well. You know, we make a big deal out of teaching things like phonics, which, and as well we should, and yet if you look at the impact of that kind of decoding instruction and decoding ability on students' ability to comprehend, what you find is that listening comprehension picks up additional variance. I'm going to talk about this a bit more as we move ahead, but statistically, it's really clear that the better readers are kids who are good listeners. And if we can move this forward.
Oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to move it forward. It's not responding. Come on, there we go.
Oh, there we got it. Thank you. There are other kinds of studies about this relationship between listening comprehension and reading that I think are important. For example, the National Early Literacy Panel, which was a panel that looked at the kids' growth in literacy in the preschool and kindergarten years. I chaired this panel, and so I know something about its findings. And you know, they start with the youngest kids, and we're talking there before kids are really reading. And so, you know, the issue there is, you know, do young children's language and listening ability connect up not with their reading right then, but their reading later on? And we found some interesting things. You know, we expected reading comprehension to be very dependent on kids' language. And when we did the analyses, we were kind of shocked to find that it was actually had a fairly small relationship, and that threw us a bit. But we went back and we took a look at the studies that had, you know, how they measured language. And a lot of them measured language simply by vocabulary, you know, things like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test and those kinds of measures. And frankly, they just didn't have that much of a relationship with reading. It was relatively small, and it wasn't a different relationship with decoding or reading comprehension. It came out the same. So our crew decided that the thing to do was to break those data out and look at all those different kinds of relations. And what we found was that while the relationship of any single language factor was relatively low, when you looked at language, you know, with its multiple components, vocabulary and grammar and listening ability and those kinds of things, what we found was that kids' early language development, including listening, had a fairly large and significant relationship with later reading achievement, particularly reading comprehension. And we found that relationship, even though now we're, you know, in those kinds of studies, we're looking at usually kids 3 and 4 years old and 5 years old. Studies that the armed forces put out in the 1970s show that, in fact, this relationship between listening and reading comprehension is quite high in the adult years as well. They were finding with their Army recruits and so on that how important listening and how closely connected to reading comprehension was. Now, all of those studies that I just talked about on those 2 slides are all correlational. They're all focused on the fact that the better listeners tend to be the better readers. They don't reveal the reasons for it. All they do is tell you that, you know, it's pretty consistent, whether you're talking little kids or kids through the elementary or middle school or high school grades or even into adulthood. The people who are better at comprehending what they listen to also tend to be better at what they read. Now, it could be that those relationships are causal. That means if you could make kids better listeners, you'll make them better readers, or vice versa. But it's not necessarily so. There are all kinds of things that are correlated with each other where people do, you know, both of these things well, and then you get better readers. And so and yet there's no real link between them. If you made people better at one or the other, it wouldn't have any impact. So we need to look at those kinds of studies as well. And if we can move forward. This is my attempt at showing you one of the big theories in reading development. This is known as the simple view of reading. And it's one where, as you can see, listening plays a very big role. Some of my colleagues a while back hypothesized that reading really only included two major components: the ability to decode, that is, the ability to translate the print that you see on a page into oral language by essentially sounding out the words and such, and listening comprehension. If I can translate this text into words, then I should be able to comprehend the words by ear the same way that I listen. And there have been a large numbers of studies of this that are actually showing that this simple view of reading, that it's just these two components, doesn't capture all the variation in reading, but it captures most of it. It is a very well thought of view. But in this view, of course, if you improved students' listening comprehension, if they got better and could understand by ear more complex language and such, they would become better readers. And so it would really argue that the improvement of listening comprehension would have a causal effect on reading. If we can move this forward again. Unfortunately, if you go looking for studies where someone has gone in and trained kids to listen better with the idea of seeing a payoff in reading, those studies unfortunately don't exist. They just haven't been done. So this isn't a case where people have done this and it hasn't worked out the way the theory predicts. But just for the most part, there aren't really studies that have explored the issue, which is perhaps kind of surprising, since these views about the importance of listening have been around for such a long time. Maybe the closest I could come was a single randomized trial in which the training in oral language, and it was a training in oral language, it included listening, but it included other components of oral language, found that by improving the kids' ability to use language, reading comprehension improved. And so, that's the only direct evidence that I have of what we're talking about. And it certainly would be possible that the reasons for the improvement were due to some other aspect of oral language, not the listening. And yet there are all these correlational studies suggesting that the unlikelihood of that. If we can move this forward again.
Yeah, Timothy, I want to pick up on that and ask you a little bit more about why do you think there's been so little research in this area? If there's an agreement on the simple view of reading that listening comprehension is key to early reading, why do you think it's been so under-researched?
To tell you the truth, I think one of the reasons is just because of the ubiquity of listening comprehension. That the fact is that, except for kids who have, some kind of sensory deprivation or serious, sensory disability like deafness or whatever, I think the assumption has generally been that everybody can listen, everybody picks up oral language, or virtually everybody does. Research doesn't actually support that popular view. There are big differences in how well people listen, but I do think that that's certainly one of the reasons. And so you'll see large, that simple view slide that I had up there before, there are large numbers of studies that look at how do you teach decoding, because we know that kids don't just come to school and know how to decode usually, and that they don't learn to do that without some kind of instruction in most cases. But the listening part, we tend to just assume it's all going to be fine, and kids are going to develop that naturally. And so their view starts to be that reading is no more than decoding, and the comprehension that we all can do through oral language. But as I say, I don't think that really bears scrutiny. It just maybe explains the reason why people haven't been so diligent or energetic in their efforts to study that. I would point out one other thing, though. That let me just, Monica, one other thing that is true, though. There are a number of studies, especially with younger kids, where people want to teach comprehension to sort of see, what kind of procedures might help kids with reading, and they literally will do studies with listening comprehension as the outcome, and they'll say, see, and that'll improve reading, even though they don't really collect the data to make that connection. So it's not like they ignore it totally, but they don't study it directly.
That is really interesting, and I think it explains why in most schools, instruction in the skill of listening comprehension gets little attention. Even though there are now state and national assessments are starting to include listening testing, there are very few ways to even prepare for those state level tests that test listening, because as many of you probably know, listening is now part of the Common Core. It's an anchor standard of the Common Core, speaking and listening, and it's in most state standards, even if they're not Common Core states, and it's being tested in 16 states. Many of them use the Smarter Balance test, but others, like Florida, test listening as part of the reading comprehension portion of the test, where a student will be asked to read a text, listen to a story on the same subject, and maybe look at a graph and then answer a few questions. But it's been interesting to us too that I think whether there's what's holding back the field might be that there's no standardized listening measure. And Timothy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because we have so many ways to measure reading and track progress in reading, but that doesn't exist in listening, right?
No, we really don't. There certainly are language tests, usually given to younger kids, sometimes given to second language kids, that have listening components. Those vary greatly. Some of them, they read a story to the kids and ask the same kinds of questions that you'd ask in a reading test. In other cases, a lot of these listening tests are really following directions tests. They'll give kids a 1 or 2 or 3 part direction. And so we don't really have, tests that are comparable in scope to the kinds of reading comprehension tests that we give. I would like to correct one thing. You said most of the states have listening standards. I've reviewed all the state standards, and they all have listening standards. It's required in all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico. So this is something that, and in fairness, it has been in standards for a very long time. But schools have tended to handle listening and language the same way that the researchers have. The notion that our kids can do that already. They come to school able to listen. But you're not just talking about doing something like being able to follow a 1 or 2 part direction, like, go over there and pick up the pencil. The kinds of things that you expose kids to on ListenWise really require some thoughtful attention and some real thinking and cognitive performance while you're listening to more complex messages, really.
Right, and that's what these students are being tested on. So I'll go to the next slide to talk a little bit about some of the things we do on ListenWise to help improve listening comprehension, and I'll show you a little bit about it in a moment. But we've developed a listening challenge level because, as we noted, there's no universally accepted measure of listening like there is in reading, like the Lexile level. But we understand that teachers need a way to understand how difficult a passage is. So that's one thing we provide to teachers. We also have a lot of close listening activities. Similar to a close reading exercise, there are ways that you can train students to listen for the main idea, or stop at a certain point and ask them for a question about their understanding of the audio, or listen for an inference. We also have created a formative listening assessment. This is an auto-scored multiple choice quiz of listening that looks at 8 substrands of listening. And this has been really fascinating to me because, as I said, I came out of journalism, and I went into this, this endeavor thinking that there would be some way to test listening, not that we would be at the forefront of helping to create it and make some first attempts at trying to track students' listening skills based on 8 different substrands of listening, including things like, can you identify a main point in a word in context? Do you understand a detail recall? Things like that. So I'm just going to pop over for a minute to ListenWise so that you can see all that I'm talking about, because what ListenWise does is it's a collection of 1,500 curated audio stories from public radio and podcasts. Many of these stories are from NPR, and you've probably heard them on your way home to and from teaching if you're an NPR listener. And what we've done is categorize them also into lessons that are in ELA, science, and social studies, because listening is something you should be doing across your curriculum. And these stories help you do that by finding a 3 to 5 minute story that is aligned to what you're teaching in your curriculum. Now, I will say these lessons are for middle and high school students, so really geared toward 5 through 12. However, none of the stories are also acceptable for younger students. We just focus our lesson plans around middle and high school. So as I said, here's that listening challenge level. So we came up with this level with a team of experts looking at items such as how complex is the vocabulary and the syntax in the story, how long is the story, how many people are speaking in the story. And I will say that we've partnered with Timothy Shanahan on a federal grant to improve this even further and to improve the listening quizzes that we've created, because we see a lot of growth. We can see a lot of growth in this area, and it's a very important area, as Timothy has just said, to focus more on so that we can help make that link between listening and reading. So here's one of the main supports we have for listening and reading, and that is transcript is aligned to the text. So let me play a little bit of this, and you'll see how the interactive transcript follows along with the audio.
Just for a second, try to imagine a world without war, conflict, grief, or memory. Now that's the premise.
And you can see you can also slow down the audio with this little toggle switch. So these are 2 well-researched and documented approaches to improving literacy through listening by having the same language subtitling. This came out of a study in India that I'll talk about in a minute. But I just wanted to also give you a view of what this quiz looks like. So if you want to do a quick assignment to your students to see how well they listen, you can give them the audio with or without the transcript, and you can launch the quiz questions after they listen to the audio, and they can go back and refer to the audio, and then just go through these listening questions that are based on, as I said, the 8 substrands of listening that we've identified. And then when the student finishes the quiz, they see how well they've done right away. And the teacher also sees the class results in this report. The report's back out on all these strands. So it's a quick way to get a view of your students' listening abilities to start honing in on this skill. So I'm going to go back to the presentation now. That's just a taste of ListenWise. We are a free resource for teachers, so you can sign up for free at listenwise.com, and then you can get a free trial of all these features I've showed you, but there is a large audio library for you and your students that is free. So please check that out. And I'm just going to head back to the presentation and talk a little bit more about this link between listening and reading, because, you know, a recent New York Times article, actually, wait, hold on,
Did you lose one?
Oh yeah, okay, I'm going to pass it back to you, Timothy, first. Okay. And then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about some recent articles that really tie in this listening and reading element.
Monica was giving you some idea on the approach that ListenWise is taking on listening comprehension, and I think they've made some good choices, but let's get back to this notion of what's the connection in terms of reading and what kinds of listening instruction might make sense. And I guess one thing I'd point out to you is the National Reading Panel report that came out in 2000. This was a report that was done for the U.S. Congress at the request of the U.S. Congress. Now, I was a member of this panel, but they asked that a team of scientists be appointed to make a determination of what kinds of instruction improves reading achievement. The panel reviewed approximately 500 studies and concluded that students receiving explicit instruction in particular things did better. And these varied a bit by age level and so on, but phonemic awareness for kindergartners and first graders and remedial readers who were struggling in reading. That's just teaching kids to hear the sounds in the language. Phonics, teaching kids how to decode that part of the simple view that I was talking about in grades K through 2 and in the again, remedial readers. Oral reading fluency, teaching kids to read text aloud with, so that they could sound like they were on NPR, so that they could, read the text, not, accurately, quickly, but not. We're not talking speed reading. We're talking the speed of language, and with proper expression, so that you can understand the message. Grades 1 through 4 in regular classes, and beyond that for struggling readers. Vocabulary instruction, teaching kids the meanings of words and the meaningful parts of words, and comprehension. There are some itself. There are some things that you can do to be a better reading comprehender beyond being able to decode well and read fluently. For example, being able to use strategies effectively, like, frankly, some of the things that Monica mentioned in terms of listening, being able to find the main idea, or monitoring your understanding, paying attention to whether you're getting it, and if not, do something about it. Those are the kinds of things the panel found made a difference. You might notice listening, comprehension instruction isn't on there, isn't mentioned. And I would point out that, in fact, the panel didn't look at that issue. But if they had, we wouldn't have found the kinds of studies where somebody'd gone in and taught listening comprehension and shown directly a payoff in terms of reading. So on what basis would I recommend actually trying to do work with listening in the idea of supporting reading? And if we can look at the next slide. And this really gets into the notion of indirect impacts. And I think this is really very, very important. What is it that enables students to comprehend well? And let me give you a couple that are really closely related and that researchers agree. I don't think there are any researchers who disagree with this idea that these things matter in reading, but they overlap so much that there's some disagreement perhaps over which is most important or whether they're really just parts of the same thing. What I'm talking about here is vocabulary. Knowing the meanings of words is implicated to a great extent in reading comprehension. The more words that a reader knows, the better their comprehension tends to be. And I would say the same thing is true when it comes to content knowledge and that kind of thing. And so if you look at this particular slide, it shows that reading to young kids, for example, has a very clear, powerful impact on the children's vocabulary growth. In other words, they learn that vocabulary not from reading necessarily, but from listening in these particular studies. There are also a slew of studies that I think 38 studies that the National Reading Panel looked at that found that improving vocabulary improved kids' ability to comprehend. And so, you know, this notion of you know, building up, you know, kids' vocabulary, a lot of that happens through listening. It certainly happens in the listening that kids do within instruction. It happens in the listening that kids do when they're on media, and it happens certainly on when we read text to kids and things like that. And so that I don't have studies where you read to the kids and their vocabulary improves, and then you test their reading and see that the reading improves too. But I definitely have lots of studies showing that with listening input, kids improve their vocabulary, and lots of other studies showing that improving vocabulary improves reading. And we're just missing those linking studies. And if we can look at the next slide. The second part of this idea that you know, it's not just the word meanings, but it's the content itself, and this is where the researchers aren't too sure, because those things overlap so much. Vocabulary usually goes up because you know more about subjects. You read better about things both because you know the meanings of the words and because you have a knowledge of the content. And so, you know, if you're listening to a text that, you know, somebody, you know, a radio announcer is you know, putting out that explains, you know, some new scientific breakthrough, knowing science is going to help you to understand what in the heck he or she is talking about. Where do kids pick up knowledge of the world? Where do they develop their knowledge of our social and our natural world? Well, lots of places, but certainly one of those places is by listening to the kinds of radio shows that Monica was talking about, and the kinds of podcasts and things that you know, she was referring to. Those kinds of experiences build kids' content knowledge. And the more they know about science and social studies and current events and health and any number of subjects, the better they're going to read about those subjects. Again, we have very clear research showing that knowing about things, you know, people who know more read better, and yet we don't have studies where we can show if you increase the kids' knowledge, you improve their reading. So again, you know, that missing connection. The final one that I want to mention really has to do with just some real basics of reading, like making sense of a text structure, how a text is organized. We know increases the chances that kids are going to comprehend the text well, that they're going to remember the text, be able to retell it or think about it later in effective ways. We have clear studies showing that if you give kids instruction in text structure, their reading comprehension goes up. There are a number of studies on text structure that have been, the teaching of text structure, that have actually been done in a listening mode, that the researchers teach it, test it through listening, and then essentially conclude that this will likely improve the kids' reading, but without those connective studies. I guess what I'm telling you is, while I certainly can't say that it has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you teach listening and raise kids' ability to listen critically and intelligently and closely, you'll raise the reading achievement. I definitely can tell you it's a very good bet. If you want to raise kids' reading comprehension, listening would often be a good place to start. One of the ways that often works in lessons is this notion of listening comprehension as an analogy. I think of some of the most effective reading comprehension strategies, things like reciprocal teaching, where you literally start out doing it through listening. You demonstrate to the kids, you model and so on what you're talking about by using listening as the mode, with the idea that the kids will then have to translate it and transfer it to reading. And so this idea that we're going to demonstrate how to use a particular reading strategy or how to think about a particular aspect of the language or the content of a text. Doing that through listening initially and then having the kids try it with reading would really suggest that a lot of instructors and a lot of scholars in this field really believe that listening and listening improvement can be maybe not an automatic transfer point, but certainly an avenue for improving the training of reading comprehension.
Great, Timothy. I was also thinking about, as you're talking about this incidental exposure to vocabulary and how, and exposure to just more background knowledge, it made me think of the studies too that show that students can listen 2 to 3 grade levels higher than they can read. And that seems to be a result of the ability to make sense of words that you may not know when you're listening to them, as opposed to when you're reading them, that often you get stuck and you can't move on to make sense of the sentence or the follow along with the text. But that also, so that when listening, students develop this foundational language skills and learn the meaning of new words. This is obviously what happens, as you said, when anybody learns to read, or if you're learning a new language. Think of it that way. There has been a lot of study around second language study and listening. And that's what we relied on a lot to bring to our platform and our understanding of how listening plays a key role. But this element around being able to listen better than you can read is a really fascinating one. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit. Tim, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when it comes to learning language, the easiest parts of language to learn usually are listening, right? Most people can listen best and then speak maybe not quite as well and read not quite as well of that. And writing tends to be the hardest. I mean, there's certainly exceptions, but that seems to be the pattern. So the notion of stepping up from those easier, entry point aspects of language like listening and using that as kind of your step stool for getting into reading successfully really makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll note that obviously second language learners, English language learners in our classrooms are a growing population. So many of you teachers are already trying to find ways to help these students access rigorous content and learn language at the same time, and we can help do that. And I think part of the way we help is what we're looking at here is just another snapshot of that interactive transcript I showed you. Now, this is based on research from a man in India who noticed that many functionally illiterate Indians were learning how to be better readers watching Bollywood movies. And because the Bollywood movies had the English subtitles. So he has devoted his entire research career around this notion and now has a website called Planet Read. Once he discovered and then confirmed in other settings that listening to English and reading English helps decode and improve reading. So just to kind of recap a little bit about what Timothy Shanahan has been saying, incidental exposure to vocabulary through listening helps students learn the meaning of unknown words, can also be a huge help to those struggling readers and English learners. So if they haven't mastered decoding, they can still learn content. And I'll tell you that's from personal experience. It's why I started ListenWise. My daughter was a struggling reader, yet she could understand everything she heard on the radio. And I just put the two together and thought, why aren't these really amazingly compelling, interesting, fact-based, with challenging vocabulary words, why aren't they being used in the classroom? And that's what led to the creation of ListenWise. So I've seen that firsthand. And also that poor listening skills, students who have poor listening skills fail to develop adequate reading comprehension skills. We've gone over that as well. So what can you do? What can you do to help? So, it's having this increased exposure to academic language, these tier 2 and 3 words that can be so hard to get into your daily routine of teaching. It's also bringing in a variety of topics across content areas, gives students access to this vocabulary that should help them become better readers. And they also practice academic language. we have a section of the current events, which is focused on debates. So every Friday we have a current event that has a debate topic around it, and that helps you structure speaking activities so the students can practice the academic language that they've learned through listening. And then just to circle back, as Tim pointed out, the national standards, it's built into every state's instructional plan for English language learners and for general education students. Not every state tests it, but there is a trend toward more states testing listening on their high stakes tests. 2 more states are adding it this year. But in most skills, still gets little attention. So we hope that today's webinar has opened your mind and improved your understanding of the connection between listening and reading. And Timothy, you want to just kind of run over the conclusions as we wrap up here?
Okay, certainly one is listening, whether it has an impact on reading or not, is important in kids' communication and in their learning. And so it should be paid attention for that reason alone. However, reading and listening ability are related. The better listeners tend to be the better readers. Listening contributes to reading achievement by being a source of world knowledge and word knowledge. And it becomes a tool. Listening is a tool that a lot of teachers use as the basis of teaching English, as Monica said, but also teaching reading. Something I didn't mention that is, I'll sum up anyway because it's important. The impact of listening on reading increases as students progress up the grades. Listening, its impact on reading in the primary grades isn't as great as it'll be on their reading in the intermediate and middle school and high school grades, and that's important to know. And I guess the last thing I would point out is that listening, whether it's you're teaching it just so kids can listen well and use that as an avenue for learning, or whether you're doing it with the idea that it's going to have some impact on their reading achievement or some other aspect of their achievement, listening can be improved. It is a cognitive behavior that studies show instruction can improve. And I think the kinds of things that Monica is trying to do with ListenWise are really the kinds of things that listening has been found, that instruction has been found to be able to do. So you can make kids better listeners, and that very well might have a positive impact on their reading and, frankly, on their lives. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Timothy Shanahan, for sharing this important research with us and collaborating with us to bring more attention and around the importance of listening and reading. So I appreciate it. Just a reminder to everyone, you can sign up for free for ListenWise, and you get a 30-day free trial. We also have subscriptions to our premium features for teachers and schools, which you can learn more about on the platform. So I'm afraid we're out of time for questions because we went a little over, but I really appreciate everyone sticking around for this. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And just a special thanks to you, Timothy Shanahan, and for all of your knowledge and input. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Monica.